No, the dead one's down there.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, I put the dead one underneath.
Oh, good. Okay, then never mind.
I figured that'd be the smart thing so we don't mix them up.
Hey?
I figured that'd be smart so we don't mix them up.
Good call.
This was only half dead, eh?
Yeah, but it said it's more dead than that, I think.
Okay.
Like the RF can't. Who wants us to go?
When you were the Friday. Stand up and get a ball in there. What's happening in the 60s? My sleeve is right down in there. Good.
No, so it's a little bit of logistical chaos. So that's what's happening with us.
Beautiful day today, other than it's cold.
Other than
So better than last night.
Last year was freezing here.
Well, then the TV stuff. Yes, exactly.
Ask me a question.
That's something else they did for sites that was quite
You know what we're supposed to have, right? Weather? Yeah. I've been, for some years here. I've been trying for 4 years. We'll get the water. Yeah, but mine are like brown. Mine are brown. Yeah, they're just going out.
And then you know you're paid now. You need to get paid now.
Sentries, move to the left in 5. Left! Turn! Whack! March! Sentries, outward! Turn! To your positions. Quick! March!
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Canada's National Remembrance Day ceremony. Mesdames et messieurs, bienvenue à la cérémonie nationale du Jour du Souvenir du Canada. This morning, Canadians from coast to coast to coast are gathering at cenotaphs and memorials throughout Canada. All are paying their respects to the 117,000 brave men and women who sacrificed their lives for us in war and in military operations, both at home and overseas. This year, we observe a significant anniversary. Armistice 100. It has been 100 years since the signing of the armistice that ended the First World War. The Veterans Parade is arriving. La Parade des Vétérans arrive.
Parade! Attention! Parade! To your veterans! Salute!
Global News special presentation.
Good morning on this Sunday, November 11th, as Canada remembers at cenotaphs and memorials in cities and towns across this country. I have the honor of being in Ottawa this morning, and we are going to bring you the National Ceremony of Remembrance that takes place every year at the National War Memorial here in the nation's capital. As you can see, crowds are beginning to gather near the memorial. That memorial, first unveiled back in 1939, it was to commemorate the great response of Canadians in the First World War. And today, it takes on special significance because it was 100 years ago today that the armistice was signed that ended the First World War. It ended at 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th hour, and that is why we have this act of remembrance on this day, November 11th, every year. It's a cold, crisp, but clear day here in Ottawa. Hello, I'm Donna Friesen, and thanks for taking time out of your day to pause and reflect. The National Ceremony of Remembrance will begin in just under half an hour from now, right at the top of the clock, and we will pause at the hour for that moment of silence in honor of the hour when the guns fell silent back at the end of the First World War. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is not in Ottawa today. He has gone to France. He was in Vimy yesterday. Today he was in Paris along with about 70 other world leaders and dignitaries. They marked the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War at a ceremony at the foot of the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. In the pouring rain, most heads of state arrived with the French president and walked slowly to the Arc de Triomphe. The French president gave a powerful speech there about the difference between patriotism and nationalism. Our Abigail Beeman is traveling with the Prime Minister.
At the base of the Arc de Triomphe, here in the heart of Paris, dozens of world leaders gathered to pay tribute in a solemn ceremony to remember the First World War. There were all kinds of musical performances as well as letters sent by soldiers from the front during the First World War read out in different languages. But the keynote was a speech delivered by French President Emmanuel Macron. He said nationalism is the opposite of patriotism, and he spoke of the importance of the EU and the UN. Sentiments American President Donald Trump wouldn't agree with, but from the front row he applauded when Macron was finished. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau also had a front row spot, flanked by the Israeli Prime Minister and his wife and Morocco's Crown Prince and King. And there were some Canadians in the crowd, easy to identify by their poppies.
I think the important piece is the number of heads of state and heads of government that are here, that we come together and say that this is a war. We said at the time it was the war to end on all wars. Unfortunately, it hasn't been, but maybe we're a little step closer.
Thousands of people came from all over the world to watch this event, but they were kept far back from the leaders, watching on giant screens instead. And even the rain, which was at times pouring, didn't thin those crowds. Abigail Beeman, Global News, Paris.
To them.
All right, let's go back to the National War Memorial here in Ottawa. 100 years, of course, is a long time ago. No one alive who fought in the First World War is alive anymore. So here in Ottawa, historical reenactors have been brought in. They're in the crowd there. We might see some of them from time to time. They're wearing period uniforms, some of it original, some reproductions, to help guide guests who are here today. They'll present every veteran and caregiver of veterans with a commemorative armistice pin. Our Ottawa Bureau Chief Mercedes Stevenson is out in that crowd today near the National War Memorial. Mercedes, this is your first Remembrance Day ceremony with us here at Global News, but I know you've been to many of these before. What strikes you most about this morning?
Well, it's always an honor and a privilege to get to cover these ceremonies, Donna, and to see the veterans who have put on the uniform and sacrificed so much for our country. But today in particular, behind me, you see the National War Memorial, and on it there are those bronze statues that are so famous. What a lot of Canadians may not realize is those are soldiers from the First World War, and that arch was to commemorate them. And so being here for the anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the armistice, is particularly special because we're looking at the faces of the fallen. We're by the tomb of the unknown soldier, and that just gives it such an additional emotional impact. There are big crowds here who've come to commemorate both those who are alive and serving today, and of course those who gave their lives in the mud and the blood that was the First World War. I'm here with the Chief of the Defence Staff, General Jonathan Vance. General Vance, what message do you have for the men and women in the Canadian Armed Forces who are serving today?
Well, this marks 100 years since the war to end all wars was supposed to have been fought and won, yet conflict continues. So the service that has been rendered by so many generations over those 100 years, that service is still important. And we continue to defend Canada all around the world in the various ways that we do so in the conflicts of today. And so I think we stand on the shoulders of giants. Who've rendered service to Canada honorably, and we continue to do so, and I'm proud of that, and they should be too.
we have troops all over the world as we speak, from Ukraine to Mali. How many Canadians are serving abroad about right now, marking Remembrance Day in countries far from home?
Well, we have about 4,000 troops serving either on operations or finishing up a very significant exercise. And so about that many, I would say, would be around the world right now. Plus, you think of all the folks at embassies and on exchanges and so on. So a large number who will pause today, whatever time zone they're in, and mark this very special moment.
And sir, what will you be thinking of as you stand at this ceremony today?
Well, I think of that sweep of history and all the people that have served in my own family, those soldiers I served with in Afghanistan that I lost. But today I'm going to think especially about our Silver Cross Mother. She represents families who have lost a loved one to suicide as a result of battlefield wounds. And I think it's important and very poignant that we stand very solidly with her. Her son served honorably and died so, and I'm proud to stand with her today.
General Vance, thank you for taking the time to join us.
Thanks, Mercedes.
And Donna, obviously there, a soldier who has seen a lot of action with the Chief of the Defence Staff, one of many dignitaries who's here today.
All right, Mercedes, thank you. I did get a chance to speak with the Silver Cross Mother a few weeks ago in Winnipeg, where she's from. Anita Senarini, we're going to see her here today. She talks very movingly about her son and what an honor it is that she has been chosen, because her son was the first soldier to to die by suicide after returning from Afghanistan, and it took her 13 years to have his death recognized as being attributable to the war. So we're going to hear from her a little bit later. Right now, I'm joined here in Ottawa by Dean Oliver, who is Director of Research at the Canadian Museum of History. Thanks for being here, Dean. Always a pleasure to have your insight. 100 years ago, long time ago, and it's the date that we remember our war dead is fixed, but the way we remember events has changed dramatically. Can you start by just telling us, reminding us, why Canadians went to war in 1914?
Well, why Canadians went to war is often different than why countries go to war. And for individuals, the reasons are very diverse but quite clear. For many of them, it was adventure, employment, the pressure of friends or family, but also, importantly, a belief in king and country and cause. It would be very difficult to imagine that so many Canadians, nearly 700,000, believed in empire sufficiently to go to war for it, but they did. And they fought the war believing that, and most of them came home believing it, which is very, very clear in their letters and diaries and notes to friends. We have the image, perhaps, of an entire generation of discouraged or disappointed poets, but they were very proud of their war. And so the first generation of remembrance was one of victory and pride. It was very devastating for the country, as you know, the great conscription debates, people dying on the streets of Canada for different interpretations of that war. But generally speaking, those individuals were proud of their service, and they came home believing they'd won and that they'd fought for something.
And really, it wasn't until the 11th hour that the guns fell silent. And there was a story of one particular Canadian soldier who died minutes before the armistice was signed. Tell us about George Price.
Yes, George Lawrence Price. He was, though accounts of his death differ, it was between 2 and 3 minutes before the end of the armistice. The Corps had received word that the guns would fall silent at about 6:30 in the morning, but it took a couple of hours for that news to reach all of the units. Price was leading a small patrol, entered a house, and as he left, was shot by a German sniper. A very interesting story. He was a farm laborer, Nova Scotia born, but from Saskatchewan, and so he met the image of the mythical Canadian hard laborer, the giant Canuck that had come to save the empire. And his family at the end of the war celebrated victory and found out, of course, only later, sadly, that he had died.
It's such tragic circumstance. We're looking at his picture there. It looks like so many of the young men involved in the war, and so young, right? And from such a diverse background in Canada. A key player.
Just before his 26th birthday.
Wow.
Yeah.
Another key player, a Canadian man, was commanding the Canadian Corps from 1917 until the end of the First World War. Tell us what Arthur Currie is remembered for.
Currie is widely remembered as being certainly the most successful Canadian senior officer of the First World War, probably one of the most successful imperial officers of the war, and maybe the most successful Canadian general ever. He was an unlikely soldier, a real estate agent. He didn't cut a fine figure in a uniform as Earl Haig and many others had, but he had a very keen military mind. He was a planner. He was a very good logistician. And though he lacked a kind of personal affinity or charisma with his troops, he was very concerned about their welfare. And so he planned battles meticulously.
He wouldn't send them into battle until there was a meticulous plan.
He did indeed, and numerous times wound up in trouble with some of his British more senior commanders for not responding quickly enough. But Currie was, I think it's fair to say, a military genius. And his greatest battles, of course, were the 100 Days, which ended in November 11th, 18.
Yeah, which were so significant for Canada and for all of the Allied forces in the war.
Mm-hmm. These were the battles that convinced the German high command that perhaps they needed to seek peace.
All right. Dean Oliver from the Canadian Museum of History, thanks. We're going to come back to you a little bit later. Many of the commemorations taking place on this day this year are in France and are in Belgium, and that's where our Mike Armstrong has spent the last week or so at cemeteries and at services there, coming across some remarkable stories, some remarkable people. Today, Mike Armstrong is in the Belgian town of Mons. Mike, what's happening there today?
Well, this might not be the biggest ceremony in Europe for Remembrance Day, but I'll tell you, it's extremely special. This is the city that was liberated by Canadian forces on the last day of the war. It's also the city where the war began in 1914 in August. British troops were pushed out. The first shots were fired here. And I'll tell you a little bit about how it feels to be here. The gentleman over my shoulder, that's a Canadian soldier who's stationed at NATO headquarters, so here in Brussels, in Belgium. And just a moment ago, there was a native group out of Winnipeg on the stage during the ceremony here. So you get a bit of Canadian overload here.
It's been a remarkable week for you, Mike. Give us a sense of some of the stories that have struck you the most being there.
Yeah, well, we went to the Glade of the Armistice, which is in France, and that's where the armistice was actually signed on November 11th, sort of around 5 o'clock, and it came into effect at 11. And one of the things that you sort of think about there when you're there is that they could have ended the war at 5 o'clock when they reached that deal. They could have just said, okay, the war's over, but they didn't, and it kept going for about 6 more hours. And if you speak to historians, most of the military operations took place once the sun came up. So probably between 5 and 11 would be the majority of the people that died on that day. More people died on that day, likely after 5 o'clock and before 11, than died on D-Day. So that gives you a pretty good idea of how much fighting there was, even on the very last day of the war.
Yeah, the numbers are absolutely staggering. We're going to go through them a little bit later. Mike Armstrong in Mons, Belgium. Thanks so much. Back here in Ottawa at the National War Memorial, our chief political correspondent David Aiken has been out this morning in the crowd. Of course, we're talked a lot about the First World War, but there are veterans from all the other conflicts, the veterans who are still alive who have made it out this morning. And David, you've had a chance to speak with some of them.
That's right, and we've got a great variety of the generations of veterans, if you will. Of course, Donna, you mentioned there are no longer any more surviving veterans from the First World War, but plenty from the Second World War, from campaigns in Cyprus, peacekeeping campaigns in Yugoslavia, and of course many of our Afghanistan veterans. And when I was talking to them this morning, I wanted to learn from them why it was important for those veterans to be here today.
I feel that I need to be here because my father and my grandfather both served. My grandfather in the First World War, my father in the Second World War. And having served myself, I know just how much my fellow soldiers put to one side in order to serve for their country. And it was hard for many. They had families at home, and they were leaving their families, and spent months, and some of them a lot more than that, overseas, away from their families. And they did it because they had this sense that they were doing something for Canada.
It's remembering those that have served and still do serve. and those that gave their lives for what we have today, even for what I have, which I feel I have to honor. It's something that we all have to give thanks for.
And Donna, there are tens of thousands of people who have gathered around the memorial. Of course, it's right off Parliament Hill today. And one of the other things you'll see that's so heartwarming and heartwarming for veterans is lots of folks with signs that say thank you. And I think that's one of the big messages as well for those serving now and those who did serve. Donna?
It certainly is. David Aiken, thanks. It's such a range of people that we see there at these services, too. It's not just veterans, but of course their families. Important to remember that the families are a huge part of every soldier who goes to war. And so many of those people are out with their children, with their aunts and uncles and grandparents. It really is a family event. The scope of the First World War, we talked about a little earlier, is simply staggering. The precise numbers are hard to pin down because of the lack of reliable statistics from back then, and of course varying accounts from historians. But AFP, the Associated France Press, has compiled what they say are the most widely accepted figures about the Great War.
The nations involved accounted for more than 800 million people, more than half the world's population at the time. 70 million troops fought, and about 10 million were killed. Germany and Russia suffered the highest number of dead and injured. Close to 61,000 Canadians were killed, and another 172,000 were wounded. Newfoundland, then a British colony, lost 1,305 men. The opening weeks of the war exacted the heaviest human toll. For example, 27,000 French soldiers were killed in a single day on August 22, 1914, the deadliest day in the history of the French army. The conflict saw the first large-scale use of chemical weapons when German forces deployed chlorine gas at Ypres in Belgium in 1915, and toxic gas eventually claimed 20,000 lives. Between 5 and 10 million civilians are estimated to have been killed in the war and its many consequences, including famine and forced displacement. There were 6 million prisoners of war. The war left 10 million refugees across Europe, and 3 million widows, and 6 million orphans.
And as we wait for all the dignitaries to arrive and for the top of the hour and the moment of silence, we also remember today not just the past, but the Canadian men and women who are serving in the military right now. For the first time in nearly a decade, Canada began a peacekeeping mission. This one is in the West African nation of Mali, and it is the most dangerous UN mission in the world right now.
Canadian armed forces are helping to bring stability to Mali, which is one of the poorest countries in the world. In 2012, the president was ousted in a coup, and the military took power, suspending the constitution and dissolving government institutions. Rebels took over 3 major cities. The French military and other African Union states intervened, and a peace accord was signed in 2015, but implementation is slow, and Mali remains volatile and dangerous. Canadian forces arrived in northern Mali in June 2018. 250 personnel, 3 Chinook helicopters, and 5 Griffin helicopters. They're available 24/7 for medical air evacuations of injured UN troops. The mission is called peacekeeping, but it's more complicated than that. More than a dozen militant groups, including Islamist militants with links to Al-Qaeda, are fighting in Mali, and UN troops are sometimes caught in the middle and sometimes targets themselves. Most expect the conflict in Mali to drag on for years. After 1 year, all of the troops and aircraft are heading home. Operation Presence is set to wrap up at the end of July 2019.
All right, and as we were watching that information about Mali, there's the Silver Cross mother, Anita Senarini, just taking her place on the dais there. She lives in Winnipeg now, originally from Ontario, and she represents all mothers. I hope we'll see a picture of her again shortly. She represents all mothers who lost a child in the service of the military. That's what the Silver Cross Mother is about. Every year, someone is chosen to do that job. It's a job that no mother wants.
Arriving now is Her Excellency, the Right Honourable Julie Payette, Governor General.
And there is the Governor General just about to arrive. But I want to take you through my interview, my story with the Silver Cross mother. It is a very powerful one. She is the first Silver Cross mother whose child died by suicide. Here's her story.
Thomas was a very easy child. He was laid back, easygoing.
Her son's story starts with such happiness. Thomas Welch was a precocious child who loved the outdoors and dreamed of becoming a cop. A family friend told him joining the military would set him on the path.
He signed up the end of August of 2001. And then 9/11 happened.
When you saw the attacks of 9/11, did you connect the dots and think this might mean my son could go to war?
We were watching it unfold on the television, and Thomas said to me, "Mom, I'm going to have to go to war." And I immediately started crying, and I said, "I know, Thomas, you just signed up. You don't have to go anywhere." And he just looked at me and he said, "Mom, they're going to need me more now than ever."
He was 21 when he deployed, an infantryman with the 3rd Battalion, Royal Canadian Regiment.
Did he want to go to Afghanistan when he was deployed?
Well, he never told me that he didn't want to go.
But the family soon noticed changes in him.
Family meant everything to him. But when he came home on leave, it was like he couldn't be around us. He always had to leave.
He'd call home and talk to his mother for hours. Once it was about Corporal Jamie Murphy, who'd been killed by a suicide bomber. Welch was distraught, telling his mom there'd been some change of plans and that he, not Murphy, was supposed to be the rear gunner that day.
He was sobbing, and it was hard to understand between the sobs what he was saying, and I just felt that I needed to assure him that it wasn't supposed to be him.
Do you think he felt guilt as a result of that?
Well, because I know Thomas, I knew that that would have played very heavy on his heart.
He carried on as a solid soldier with a cool head, but his mom says his light had gone out.
Personality-wise, almost unrecognizable.
Less than 3 months after his deployment ended, he hanged himself. He was the first soldier who'd returned from Afghanistan to take his own life. And then he was officially forgotten. The military ruled his death had nothing to do with his deployment.
And you quite clearly recognized that it was attributable to his service in Afghanistan. There was no question in your mind. Right?
Never wavered.
For 13 years, she fought for her dead son's honor, keeping a candle lit on his memorial tree in the backyard. Finally, last year, his death was reclassified.
This is his medal of sacrifice.
Died in his country's service.
Yeah.
And it took you years to get that.
13. Yeah.
And so what does it mean to have that recognition now? What does it mean for you and for your family?
Well, I don't want to seem trite, but I did it for Thomas.
She did it for her son, and now, as the Silver Cross mother, for all the military mothers whose children have died by suicide.
The moment that they put the uniform on and their boots hit the ground, that they're heroes.
Remembered not for how they died, but how they lived.
The story of Private Thomas Welch. A very moving story. There's the Defense Minister, Harjit Sajjan, as the dignitaries begin to gather. I just want to go to Dean Oliver for a bit more of context about that idea of soldiers dying by suicide. It's, of course, not a new phenomenon. And Afghanistan and Thomas Welch and all the other soldiers who have since taken their own lives sadly followed in a a path that others have taken over the years. Why was it? Why were they forgotten? What was the military kind of thinking traditionally about soldiers who had such difficulty coping after they returned from deployment?
Historically, Donna, we've always struggled as societies, as military organizations, with the implications of military service. War is focused very much on doing things, on achieving the objective and gaining peace, on winning, and trying to figure out, even during wartime, the impacts on mind and body of military service has been very, very difficult and has oftentimes required that military organizations improvise as they go. Even harder has been the longitudinal effect, both on mind and on body, of that military service, and not only for those who served, but those who love them. We are belatedly, but thankfully, in an era now where military organizations are beginning to recognize this, with the stigmas attached to talking about mental illness of all kinds are beginning to fall down, and where also families, such as the one we just heard about, have the courage with military veterans organizations to continually make their case, to put before the public the notion that the impact of military service doesn't end when the guns fall silent.
Certainly doesn't end, and that the families are wrapped up in all of it when their loved ones come home from deployment.
They absolutely are.
Yeah. Dean Oliver, thank you. Let's now listen in. We're approaching the 11th hour Eastern Time of the 11th day of the 11th month. The Ottawa Children's Choir is going to sing O Canada, accompanied by the Central Band of the Canadian Forces, and then we will pause for the moment of silence. As we just listened to the end of the Piper's Lament, I want to bring in Dean Oliver. Dean, what is the significance of this piece of music?
This is the official lament of the Canadian Forces, based on very old music, the sounds of which originally mimicked the sounds of women and children crying over their dead from past battles.
Wow. And there is the fly past. 5 CF-18s this morning from 4-wing Cold Lake, Alberta. Beautiful shot this morning as they fly off into the sun. And now the rouse. Dean, tell us about this piece.
This is the call to duty after loss and commiseration and grief over the dead. The call back to life of those who have survived, to their duty to flag and king and country.
Duty begins again. Mm-hmm. And now the act of remembrance, spoken, delivered in 3 languages.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
Ils ne vieilliront pas comme nous, qui leur avons survécu. Ils ne connaîtront jamais l'outrage, ni le poids des années. Quand viendra l'heure du crépuscule et celle de l'aurore, nous nous souviendrons d'eux.
Je me rappelle, ils ne vieilliront pas comme nous autres, ils ne sont pas accaparés de là. Quand le soleil se couche et quand il se lève, on va se rappeler d'eux autres, on va se rappeler d'eux autres.
We're hearing the CF-18s cross over us one more time. Now the prayers will be led this morning by Brigadier General Guy Chapdelaine, the Chaplain General of the Canadian Armed Forces. He has been a member since 1979.
We gather today on this hallowed ground, on which is entered Canada's unknown soldier, to remember all those who made the ultimate sacrifice. On the centennial of the signing of the armistice, we honor those whose names we know and those whose names are known to God alone. Dans le respect des croyances individuelles, j'invite toutes les personnes qui veulent se joindre à moi dans la prière à tourner leur cœur vers le Dieu de leur foi ou à prendre un moment de réflexion personnelle. Please join me in prayer or in a moment of personal reflection. Loving God, we give thanks for those who have given their lives in the service of justice and peace. We know that peace is more than tolerating one another. It is recognizing ourselves in others and realizing that we are all on the path of life together. Lord of justice and peace, enable us to lay down our own weapons of exclusion, intolerance, hatred, and strife. Make us instruments of your peace, that we may seek reconciliation in our world. As we remember those who return from past wars with injuries, both visible and invisible, inspire us to care for all military personnel who are wounded in body, mind, and soul. Help us to have compassion for our brothers and sisters who, for reasons known and unknown, have considered or attempted suicide. May we be compassionate for the families and friends impacted by these tragedies. Nous nous souvenons des familles, des amis, des collègues et du personnel soignant, de ceux et celles qui, en temps de guerre et de paix, ont fait le sacrifice de leur vie pour restaurer la paix. Sois leur soutien et leur force dans les moments de deuil. Nous prions pour tous les militaires déployés autour du monde, dévoués au mieux-être de l'humanité et à la promotion de la justice et de la paix. Inspire-leur de donner le meilleur d'eux-mêmes pour la cause de la liberté. Nous prions pour notre souveraine, Sa Majesté Élisabeth II, Reine du Canada, pour la gouverneure générale, le Premier ministre, le ministre de la Défense nationale, le chef d'état-major de la Défense et toutes les personnes en autorité. Que la sagesse et la compassion les accompagnent dans leurs fonctions. On this centennial year of the armistice, we remember and pay respects to our fallen by answering their call to peace. Dans cette espérance, nous te prions.
Please be seated. Veuillez vous asseoir. Ladies and gentlemen, the Vice-Regal Party will now begin placing their wreaths. There will also be a special wreath placed in memory of all Canadians who served in the First World War. We honor their service and sacrifice 100 years later, fulfilling our obligation to never forget. Mesdames et Messieurs, le cortège vice-royal déposera maintenant les couronnes. Il y aura aussi une couronne spéciale qui sera déposée à la mémoire des Canadiens et Canadiennes qui ont servi durant la Première Guerre mondiale. 100 ans plus tard, nous rendons hommage à leur service et à leur sacrifice, remplissant notre devoir de ne jamais oublier.
there is the Silver Cross mother, Anita Senarini, placing a wreath on behalf of all mothers who have lost children in the service of the military. Her own son, Private Thomas Welch, was 22 years old when he took his own life after he returned from his deployment in Afghanistan, and he was the first soldier to take his own life after returning from that conflict. And what you can hear in the background as the wreath laying continues is the Ottawa Children's Choir singing a new version of In Flanders Fields. There's the Defence Minister laying a wreath. Harjit Sajjan, of course, himself a veteran. He's laying a wreath on behalf of the Government of Canada. The Prime Minister, as we said, in case you're just joining us, is in France, commemorating this moment there with other world leaders. So the Governor General is here and the Defence Minister. I wanted to talk about In Flanders Fields a little bit with our historian, Dean Oliver, because the song is, and the poem, of course, In Flanders Fields is sort of, it's almost like the anthem for these services. We know it so well. The poppies and the story of the poppies is such a part of our act of remembrance every year. What is it about that song that has particular significance today?
It, both in the time and since, Don, I think it's kind of hit the perfect sweet spot between humility but service, between sacrifice and the vileness of war, but also friendship and comradeship, and manages to speak across time. There's also a context to it that has given it poignancy. It was written in the aftermath of the Canadians' first great battle of the war. Thousands were killed, wounded, gassed, and he personally had lost a friend in a unit, in fact a unit that was based here in Ottawa. And so it was also written very much from his heart, from grief. And it had the story at the end of the war of himself, a healer, a man given to saving lives, dying of disease and the conflict that the effects of which he himself had tried to ameliorate. You'd be hard-pressed, I think, to find a poem that incorporates so many of those things spawned in the horror of the moment that has stood the test of time. So it really is a mantra or a touchstone for remembrance, and I suspect 100 years from now our descendants will be saying very much the same thing.
It's important to keep that story alive, and 100 years ago, suddenly, when you tell these stories, doesn't seem that long ago.
No.
It doesn't.
No, it does not.
Yeah. All right, Dean Oliver, thank you. Let's go to Mercedes Stevenson, our Ottawa Bureau Chief, who is in the crowd there. Mercedes, we watched the Silver Cross mother lay her wreath on behalf of all mothers who lost a child in the service of war. I had a chance to speak to Anita Senarini, and it was one of the most difficult interviews I've done because she is, her son's suicide, though it was 14 years ago, is so raw for her and so difficult for her. And she is taking it as a sign of great honor and with great pride that she is able to represent not just all mothers who lost their children, but mothers and families who also lost soldiers through suicide. And how do you feel the military, is this a turning point for the military a little bit, that they have recognized the significance of this and the toll that mental health takes on veterans?
I think it's a tremendous moment in that recognition of the invisible wounds that so many come home with and suffer with in silence. As you know, there was a suicide epidemic among our veterans. It is still taking people regularly, and it is something we need to pay very close attention to as a country. To see the military and the Legion recognize the Silver Cross mother as the mother of a young man who died by suicide is saying, yes, this is a war wound. We recognize this is related to your service. Donna, I remember when these young men and women would take their lives and there would be no regimental presence at their funeral. It was seen as something that was shameful or the antithesis of being a soldier. And now the realizations about mental health and post-traumatic stress disorder have drastically changed the way that's seen. And this is the military and the Legion officially saying those who have lost their lives to suicide were as much a casualty of the war as those on the battlefield. And while it does not bring those people back to us, it does bring comfort to their families, and there's the hope that it helps people to feel they can come forward who are in uniform now. This is not a shameful thing. It is a war injury, and to seek treatment so that we can prevent more of those deaths.
All right, Mercedes Stevenson, thanks so much. As we continue to watch the wreath laying, our David Aiken is there in the crowd as well. And David, you wrote a piece that's gotten a lot of attention. It was about the fact that the Prime Minister is not in Ottawa for this service, and he is in France, and there's a good reason why he's in France. Give us some of your thoughts about that.
Yeah, that's right, Donna, and it's perfectly normal, to be honest with you, for a Prime Minister to be somewhere else, not in Ottawa for the National Remembrance Day ceremony. The most important official is the one that is presiding over this ceremony, and that is the Governor General, in this case Julie Payette. The Governor General, of course, is the Commander-in-Chief of the forces, and the Governor General, of course, is the representative of the monarch, in whose name all our serving men and women do their service. You're right that the Prime Minister today is where so many Canadians, 60,000 Canadians, lost their lives in the First World War. But in previous years, we've seen Prime Minister Harper mark Remembrance Day in Seoul, South Korea, where, of course, many Canadians served, died in that war. I stood with Prime Minister Harper several years ago in the cemetery in Hong Kong, where many Canadians, 228 Canadians, are buried in Saiwan Cemetery. And so I think the point there, Donna, is it's not about where the act of remembrance is made. It's about the act of remembrance itself. This is certainly a very special ceremony, and it's a very special place. If you're ever in Ottawa on November 11th, you must come to this ceremony and see it in person. But again, just as it is in ceremonies around the country right now, it's all about the act of remembrance.
It certainly is. And David, you know, we should point out that the Governor General is here in Ottawa this morning for this service. She also was in France and Belgium, though, and she took a flight overnight to come back to be here for this.
Absolutely. She was in Belgium yesterday, and in fact, she was at the grave of the last Commonwealth soldier killed in the fighting, the Canadian. That's where she was in Mons, Belgium yesterday, and as you mentioned, she took the overnight flight to be here. Governor General, in my experience, and this is, I think, number 17 on the Hill for me, perfect track record, and certainly perfect track record going back to the first real National Remembrance Day ceremony, which happened right about the time this monument was erected in the 1930s.
David, give us some of your thoughts after having covered a number of these and been there both, you know, as a reporter and as just a Canadian. What's your feeling as you attend these year after year, and as you know, become more mature and see things perhaps in a different light and a more thorough picture?
Every year, it's very similar feelings. It's impossible. You're not a reporter, you're not anything, you're a Canadian. And particularly for someone like me, I did not serve, to be so thankful for those who did. We're of the generation, Donna, you and I, that we've been remarkably free, by and large, of major world wars. Certainly there's been conflicts in Afghanistan, Yugoslavia, and elsewhere. But it's a very emotional ceremony when you're here looking at those who served, continue to serve, and the feeling of gratefulness for their service.
All right, David Aiken near the War Memorial there, and a beautifully sunny, crisp, a little bit cold, but sunny, glorious day in Ottawa as people continue to lay the wreaths there. I want to go back to Dean Oliver. Dean, we've talked a lot about the First World War, and they didn't call it the First World War, of course, when it ended 100 years ago today, because it was the Great War, and they really believed it was the war to end all wars, which of course it turned out not to be. The armistice did not bring lasting peace. What events were triggered after this armistice was signed that led us to the Second World War so very quickly?
Well, history gives us the privilege of hindsight, which Eisenhower said was 20/20, and so we know how it turned out. But at the time, it looked as though enemies had been defeated on all fronts, that perhaps all sacrifices had not been in vain, and that Europe would restore itself and the world would go on as it had been in 1914. However, it was a victor's peace. We sought to punish those we had defeated, rightly or unjustly. War was not entirely ended. Russia was in civil war. There was fighting in Central Europe. And Germany never entirely accepted the fact that it had lost. Allied armies only occupied very briefly small portions of Germany. Germans felt unhappy about the blockade, which had largely starved them through the end of the war. And it was very easy in the chaotic politics of Central Europe after the war to believe that they had gotten a bad shake. And so the seeds of that second war really were very deeply sown, not only in Europe, but also in the redrawn boundaries of the Middle East and in Africa, the rise of Japan in Asia. And so in that retrospect, it looks as though little was settled and perhaps some other things were caused, but it wasn't the sense of the victors in Paris in 1919.
And tell us, going back to the end of the First World War, Canadians were very pivotal. We touched on a little bit in the 100 days. What was it that Canadians did differently, commanded by General Currie, that became so successful?
We were blessed with not only having a great commander on the battlefield, but he was a great organizer and administrator. And so he did many things, including keeping the size of our actual combat units a little larger than those of British forces or Australian and New Zealand forces around him. He wasn't unusual in being an effective commander, but he was unusual in having the power of a growing nationalism of a government behind him. And so Prime Minister Borden supported him in some of these decisions, which made Canada slightly outsized or perhaps slightly punching above its weight in 1918. That impacted our presence, as it did some of others, Australia, New Zealand, post-war, and led directly to the attainment of autonomy over foreign affairs for those dominions by the 1930s. But we owe much of that to individuals, Currie and Borden, but bought at tremendous cost.
And what lessons, there's some wonderful exhibit on the last 100 days. We're just looking at some of the pictures now. Here in Ottawa, if you're in Ottawa, it's definitely something worth seeing. What lessons do we take away from that, even though it was so long ago?
A great many. It can sound overly pious to pronounce on the lessons of the past, but from the war itself, from Canada's perspective, nothing good comes cheap, and they bought a professionalism and a competence at the cost of many, many tens of thousands of dead. As nations, your independence sometimes will require that you stand up and be counted in other times of crisis, which happened in World War II. And as people and as citizens, the past is worthy of respect, not only because of the activities of governments and politicians and anonymous organizations, but the human respect of those on whose shoulders you stand, as one of your colleagues said earlier. And in this case, those are the men and women who served Canada through 4 years of horror.
Dean Oliver, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
The service here in Ottawa is going to continue, as it will in cities and towns across the country. That concludes our coverage of this Remembrance Day from Ottawa. Thank you for spending some time with us, for taking a moment out of your day to remember, to pay tribute, and to reflect. I'll be back later today with all the day's news on Global National. I'm Donna Friesen. For now, thanks for watching.
Nous sommes ici sur cet emplacement sacré pour nous souvenir et témoigner. We are gathered in this sacred space, sanctified via remembrance and eternally sanctified by the precious blood spilled here. We are here to remember, to energetically express our appreciation and our gratitude to our veterans. Please join with me to express our appreciation to our veterans by saying the words, "We are grateful," when you hear the word "therefore." We remember, therefore we are grateful. We remember the supreme sacrifice so many beloved Canadians made and were ready to make on land, in the air, at sea, the dead, the wounded, the survivors, the war-bereaved, men and women, Anglophones, Francophones, First Nation members, people of many ethnic and religious communities. Therefore, we are grateful. We remember they're putting their lives on hold and at risk in order to eliminate tyranny and defend liberty. Younger veterans and older veterans who meet today in mutual respect and admiration as partners in the battle against evil. Therefore, we are grateful. We remember they're fighting our fight to assure freedom and dignity for everyone, deserving to be celebrated, applauded, and eternally appreciated as authentic heroes. Therefore, we are grateful. We remember their bravery, their dignity, their selflessness, their embrace of Canada, their devotion to global freedom and peacekeeping that defines them. They're carrying our values into challenging situations. Therefore, we are grateful. We remember their knowing that even if they return whole in body, they will still be confronted with looming issues such as PTSD, yet still risking their future on our behalf. Therefore, we are grateful. We remember the unifying inspiration of selflessness and dedication, reminding us of what being Canadian is all about. Therefore, we are grateful. May those who died be remembered lovingly. May those who were injured be healed in body and spirit. May those who served and continue to serve live out their lives in a world free of terror and suffused with tranquility, the type of world they fought to create and to preserve. How do we show gratitude to our veterans, verily our first responders to evil? By embracing them, by hugging them, by expressing our appreciation to every veteran we meet, in all places and at all times, by teaching our children how much in their debt we always will be. On this, the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War, we reflect on the notion of a world war. We ask, if the world can be at war, is it not possible for the world to be at peace? It is not only possible, it is terribly necessary. But not peace that is merely the absence of war. We gather today yearning for a world that is truly at peace. Peace that is highlighted by respect, inclusion, cooperation, helpfulness, kindness, and enveloping appreciation. That is the ultimate goal of our remembrance, a world of harmony. The goal is lofty, the commitment to that goal unrelenting, and our hope to reach that goal unwavering. Our veterans continue to fight for a better world. Let us carry that fight forward by suffocating evil through our pervading goodness, by encountering each other in the spirit of friendship, by flooding the world with good deeds. Let us continue to make Canada worthy of their dedication. May our profound embrace of remembrance and gratitude be a crowning glory for our veterans and our country. God bless our veterans. God bless our troops. God bless all those who stand on guard. Peace champions all here and abroad. God bless Canada. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, the march-off will soon commence. Our veterans will lead the parade, followed by the Royal Military College of Canada, members of the Royal Canadian Navy, the Canadian Army, and the Royal Canadian Air Force, HMCS Carleton, Governor General's Foot Guards, Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, cadets from the Navy, Army, and Air Cadet organizations, and the Navy League Cadets of Canada, and the 30th Field Regiment, Royal Canadian Artillery. Mesdames et Messieurs, le défilé de sortie avec les vétérans en tête débutera sous peu, suivi par le Collège militaire royal du Canada, les membres de la Marine royale du Canada, de l'Armée canadienne et de l'Aviation royale du Canada, HMCS Carleton, le Governor General's Foot Guards, le Cameron Highlanders d'Ottawa, la Gendarmerie royale du Canada, les cadets de la Marine, de l'Armée et de l'Air, ainsi que les cadets de la Ligue navale du Canada, et le 30e Régiment d'artillerie de campagne de l'Artillerie royale canadienne. Thank you for your attendance at the National Remembrance Day ceremony. Today is an occasion when we, as a grateful nation, stand in collective remembrance of all who have fallen in the military service of Canada. May we never forget. We ask that those wishing to place a wreath at the National War Memorial or a poppy on the tomb of the unknown soldier, please wait until the announcement that the site is open. Merci d'être parmi nous à l'occasion de la cérémonie nationale du jour du souvenir. Aujourd'hui est l'occasion où notre nation reconnaissante exprime à l'unisson le souvenir de ceux et celles qui sont morts au service de notre pays. N'oublions jamais. Nous demandons à tous ceux qui veulent déposer une couronne devant le monument commémoratif de guerre du Canada ou un coquelicot sur la tombe du soldat inconnu de bien vouloir attendre l'annonce que le site est ouvert. Finally, each evening over the past 2 weeks, during this year's Poppy campaign, the Royal Canadian Legion Dominion Command has been honored to present its virtual Poppy Drop. It can be seen on the backdrop of the Peace Tower and Centre Block, Parliament Hill. The display has already been seen by many thousands of Canadians throughout the country and around the world. It will have its concluding presentation this evening from 6:30 p.m. to midnight. The Poppy Drop is also displayed outside the National Arts Centre until midnight this evening. Please join us for this visual pledge of remembrance. Finalement, nous tenons à mentionner qu'au cours des 2 dernières semaines de la campagne du coquelicot de cette année, la Légion royale canadienne a eu l'honneur et le privilège de vous offrir chaque soir une projection spéciale, celle de la pluie virtuelle de coquelicot, sur l'écran formé de la Tour de la Paix et de l'édifice du centre de la colline parlementaire. Ce montage a été vu jusqu'ici par plusieurs milliers de Canadiens partout au pays et à travers le monde. Une présentation de clôture se déroulera en soirée de 18h30 à minuit. La pluie de coquelicot sera aussi visible sur la façade du Centre national des arts jusqu'à minuit ce soir. Veuillez vous joindre à nous dans cette manifestation visuelle très spéciale de souvenirs. Once again, please wait until the announcement that the site is open. Veuillez s'il vous plaît attendre l'annonce que le site est ouvert. Thank you for joining us this morning. Merci d'être ici.
in column of route. Right turn.
Shelby and the young guy is going to come up to the truck again.
Sure?
Yeah.
Okay.
Once again, ladies and gentlemen, please wait until the announcement that the site is open. Veuillez s'il vous plaît attendre l'annonce que le site est ouvert. Passe encore, s'il vous plaît.
Parade, by the right. Quick, march.
good.
Guys, stay on the sidewalk, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, this site is now open to place your wreath or poppy. Le site est maintenant ouvert pour faire placer votre couronne ou votre coquelicot.
ceremony.